This game is huge and a bit confusing. Labyrinth of Galleria is exactly as the title suggests, a game where we explore extensive labyrinths in search of valuable artifacts. And let me tell you this right now, it has a design that includes tons of menus, tutorials, many upgrade systems, puppet management and a well-crafted narrative. In other words, it's clear that the game's developers spent a lot of time on this, but the question is whether everything offered creates a unified product. Does everything fit together? In this review I discuss how Labyrinth of Galleria is experienced on Nintendo Switch, so let's get started. This game is about Eureka, who gets the opportunity to work in Galleria Manor, but once she arrives, the tasks she receives are somewhat unusual. We are not talking about cleaning rooms or cooking. Her main task is to help an elderly witch named Madame Marta find a number of curios. These artifacts are hidden in a giant labyrinth, which means that Eureka has to go through a large cupboard into a magic world in order to find what she's looking for. Yeah, it's a little bit weird, but it's a fantasy story, so it works. The owner of the Galleria Manor, known as the Count, needs these curios for reasons I will not reveal. But the fact is that this is a fairly dramatic story with a narrative that is mostly engaging. Sometimes it feels like the dialogues are a bit too long though. There are many exchanges that could have been shortened. Sometimes I just sit there and wonder why the characters don't get to the point. Also, because the dialogues are very lengthy, sometimes up to 45 minutes long. But even so, the story contains some disputes that catch my interest. There is an element of tension in that everything is quite vague. It's not entirely clear who or what is good or evil, which is also connected to the fact that there are so many different encounters in the game. Some characters are met only a few times, while others play a larger role in the story. It can be confusing, but if you want you can replay all dialogue. This is a good implementation in case you missed something. So the game starts with you getting to see how Eureka takes a job at Galleria Manor. Then begins a colossus of tutorials. Given the complexity of the game, these explanations are necessary to understand what this is all about. Probably. There is so much to learn and keep track of in this game, it's almost overwhelming. It's about everything from learning how to fight, to how to navigate, how to create puppets, to how to use different skills. But to break it down, we will start with the gameplay. Essentially, it's about exploring giant mazes. In these places you will find everything imaginable that can help you on your way. For example, armor, weapons or quest items. You also encounter lots of enemies that are recognizable as moving spheres with eyes on them. The labyrinths are experienced from a first-person perspective and you can move forward, backward or sideways. In order to get an overview of where you are, there is a map that is drawn as you discover new areas. I discovered that the map is vital to being able to navigate, to the point where I almost stopped playing and only followed my position from the map. And believe me, the game maps are cleverly designed to confuse you. They are large, numerous and interconnected at different levels. It's easy to get stuck, but they are also created so that you can return later and discover new areas. The further into the game you get, the more unique skills become available. For example, you can learn to jump between platforms, you can swim or smash walls to open up new paths. I think this is one of the more interesting aspects of the game, gaining new abilities that allow you to explore new areas. Too often you run into an obstacle, like for example that you can't swim, but when you learn the skill, you can get to new places and find new objects. There are also different environments to explore. In addition to water levels and the usual corridors, there are also purple levels called sacred areas. In here you have to be cleansed after a while, otherwise you go crazy and lose your health. The principle is really the same in the water courses where you lose oxygen as you go. These mechanics contribute to a reasonably varied gameplay, even if most of the time it boils down to the same thing, namely to explore labyrinths. So to the question of whether this can become monotonous in the long run. Both yes and no actually. The skills I learned kept the experience fresh. I actually found it quite entertaining to open up new areas and see how I progressed. But I also found that there was a certain amount of frustration when I got lost in some random labyrinth with no idea where to go next. I could run around for hours without finding what I was looking for, and this goes along with the extremely vague quest descriptions. Before heading out into the labyrinth, you are given a mission that usually involves finding a curio, but rarely do you get an indication of where to look, so you run around blindly. I don't know how many hours I killed just looking around, but it must have been a lot. So let's discuss character development and how it works. In fact, you don't use the game's protagonist to fight. Instead, puppets are used. By combining puppet parts and soul vials, you can create a new puppet that fights for you. And there are plenty of choices. Of course, you have the fundamental classes such as tanks, melee DPS, range DPS, and those that can function as healers. But added to this are several classes that can also function as support. This is where I think it got really complicated. A total of 15 puppets can be used in a battle, and it can be a little confusing how to organize them to be as effective as possible. They are divided into different compartments, but at the same time you can, for example, put tanks together with other classes. And believe me, it's messy and requires almost multiple tests to figure out how to get the most out of your puppets. But in my playthrough, I tried to separate the different classes, which turned out to work just fine. I also want to mention that instead of mana, you use something called a Dunam. If you use classes that need a lot of Dunam, it's good to stack them together because their individual Dunam pool adds up. By doing it this way, I noticed that I rarely ran out of Dunam. There is also the possibility to shift skills. Through various books, one can apply new forms of abilities, both magical and physical attacks. In summary, I can say that overall I think it's very complex. The combination of multiple classes, all skills, and the number of puppets used in battle makes it borderline confusing, but can also be seen as entertaining from the perspective that it leads to experimentation. Now we come to the discussion of gear. There are a lot of weapons, armor and accessories scattered throughout the game. For example, you can find items in chests and you will probably find a lot. Right now I have 26 crossbows, but only use one. Otherwise it's the typical weapons that are in question. For example, lances, swords, scythes, hammers and gauntlets. Each puppet has its own favorite weapon. A tank prefers to use gauntlets, which are advantageously used with a shield. A physical DPS prefers hammers used with both hands. What is common to all classes is that you can equip your puppets with helmets, body armor, shoes and accessories. And if you use 15 puppets, you can safely say that a lot of time can be spent on upgrades, especially since you are constantly finding new items. In addition, weapons and armor can be upgraded using alchemy. Here, for example, you can combine a weapon with 3 others to make it stronger. The main stats we are talking about are the classic ones, like attack, hit, strength and agility. There are of course many other stats to take into consideration, but the bottom line is that you often return to the equipment menu to ensure that your puppets are prepared for the dangers that lie ahead. Just like in classic RPG games, the puppets can level up. This is done by gaining experience when you win a fight or by eating meat. Yeah, it's pretty weird, but when you eliminate an enemy, you're usually rewarded with meat. When the meat is eaten, it is converted into experience points. This is actually a great way to level up newly created characters, especially if you give them meat containing a high percentage of experience. In terms of enemies, there is a plethora of different opponents, but it can be divided into 3 main categories: regular enemies, super enemies and bosses, depending on the difficulty you choose. I can say that the enemies generally offer good resistance, especially if you play on normal difficulty level and are at the same level as your opponent. However, I found that the super enemies could be really problematic. Much depends on their relatively strong attacks and large health pool. I often saw how my puppets become one-shotted. This fish is no ordinary fish. It's extremely dangerous. Just watch it eat its way through my troops until I'm game over. But if you have an eye on the map, you can see the enemy's movements, and in this way you can avoid certain encounters. You should also be prepared to fight multiple enemies at the same time, so AoE attacks may be preferable. The worst enemy in the game are probably the ones that become immune to one's attacks, such as the X. I experienced on numerous occasions how I tried to harm, but I could not penetrate its hard shell. A fight that went on for a long time. But I also have to point out the variety of monsters that exist in this game. The bosses are huge and sometimes even look terrifying. As you may have noticed by now, the battles are turn-based, and depending on how the puppets are divided, each coven can come with its own advantages. Tanks can for example attract attention by using a certain ability, which leads to a reduced risk of more fragile classes being damaged. In addition, you can move stronger classes in front of the weaker ones. It's also useful for making sure the correct class is taking the damage. You can also experiment with formations, depending on whether you want to be aggressive or defensive. Choosing a formation provides different buffs that can be beneficial, but choosing the right one can be crucial, as some formations can negatively affect certain classes. For example, there is a risk with being very aggressive and putting weak classes in the forefront. At least the formation system offers an opportunity to test different solutions. The combat system is generally well thought out and goes in line with how the game is at its most. That is, extensive. Labyrinth of Galleria is a very comprehensive game. You have many hours ahead of you if you're going to get through the whole adventure, but what makes this a great game is all the options available. Everything from handling your puppets to taking part in a well-developed narrative. It's huge. The game runs very well on the Nintendo Switch. I didn't experience any frame rate issues or crashes. Overall, it's a solid experience. However, what I found frustrating was that some missions are a bit cryptic. You don't always know where to go, which in itself can lead to exploration, but at the same time it can be a bit annoying considering the oversized maps. I can recommend this game if you like adventures that focus on exploration, character development and lots of choices, but if you want a 5-minute game, look elsewhere. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, I review new games every week. Have a good day, see ya!